Consider the lilies of the field. I count it an enormous honor to be asked to preach a sermon at Ralph's funeral. It's an honor which I promise I will not abuse by talking for too long. I've been rector here for about 6.5 years, so I haven't known Ralph for anything like the length of time all of you have known him. What I have seen of him in those 6 and something years was a man to whom nature, in all its infinite diversity, called and called. I've seen the meticulous recordings he made in words and pictures of the wildlife in this area. And as I alluded to earlier when thanking Mike for reading the psalm, I've especially appreciated his meticulous observations of the wildlife of our churchyard here at St. Faith's. Indeed, Ralph was instrumental in achieving recognition for this patch of earth as a site of special interest for nature conservation. It was Ralph, I think, who realized that since the soil of this churchyard had been undisturbed for about 150 years since its closure to new burials, as a consequence, the undisturbed grass of the churchyard had the chance to absorb myriads of wild seeds blown by the wind. It was Ralph's careful recording of some 88 different species of native British wildlife which led directly to our decision to allow sections of the churchyard to grow wild and for nature in all its glory to be allowed free rein in this little corner of an otherwise urban landscape. If you'd be interested and have time after the service, you might like to see the display of the natural work of the churchyard that's over here. Thanks to Ralph and to those who've worked alongside him, Mike and others, we and all churchyard visitors have been able, in the words of the gospel reading that we just heard, to consider the lilies. And in doing so, we have been reminded of the infinitely precious balance of nature which humankind does its level best to destroy at every turn, doesn't it? Why do we do this? Well, for profit, largely. It's never the lumberjacks who become millionaires, it's the owners of the wood that they cut down. It's never the fishermen who buy themselves fancy yachts, it's the multinational corporations who supply the factory ships. It's not the humble sewage worker at Bud's farm down the road who benefits from the discharge of sewage into Langston Harbour. It's the owners, managers, and yes, shareholders of the water company. And to each of them, and to anyone who would put profit above planet, the words of Jesus Christ still ring truthfully today. According to Jesus, Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like the lilies of the field. And yet Solomon did all he could in his time, like rich men of every generation, to amass the wealth of the world around his bed. He built an enormous palace with tons of cedar wood cut from the mountains of Lebanon. He had gold dug from the good soil. He filled it with treasure and camels and soldiers and wives. Lots of wives, apparently. He built a temple to what he considered the glory of God, forgetting that God's glory is already magnificently displayed, as Ralph knew only too well, in the lilies of the field, let alone in the mountains, the rivers, the forests, and the seas. And let us ponder this. What has happened to Solomon's great palace? What has happened to Solomon's great temple? Dust and distant memory now. While the lilies of the field, the mountains and the rivers continue to shout to all who would listen, "Here, here, here is the glory of God." Solomon, the quintessential rich man, Well, he's a lesson to all rich people, isn't he? As Jesus says in another place to another rich man, "You fool. None of us can take the stuff of the planet with us beyond the door of death. Collecting it, hoarding it, and destroying the lilies for it is simply not worth it." Ralph, I think, understood this, and I bless him for it. He was not a regular churchgoer, but I believe he saw in the face of nature something of the face of God. He knew without a doubt that the wild world we have inherited shouts of the glory of God in all its majesty and in all its detail. Ralph cherished these things. And his legacy to us is the challenge that we should cherish them too. Amen.